Jim, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We invite you to give an overview of our subject today, which is President Reagan and the Constitution, and then we'll go to questions.
All right, great. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Great to be back. Obviously, from my resume, you can get a sense that I'm a big fan of Ronald Reagan, so I'll skip all the encomiums and just let that speak for itself. I think I can illustrate President Reagan, our 40th president's view of the Constitution. Every president is different. They all take the same oath, of course, which is stipulated in the Constitution. But in President Reagan's case, I can point to sort of 5 moments and 5 themes of his presidency. And the first was back in 1964, when he was still a private citizen and never elected to anything more than the presidency of the Screen Actors Guild, which actually was a pretty good achievement, but nonetheless was not, in formal politics. He was asked to give a speech on behalf of then Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, and Reagan, who was more of a performer than Goldwater, came and gave a national speech on behalf of another candidate. It was kind of a strange thing, but they did it. And, Reagan became a star on that speech. And in that speech back in 1964, 60 years ago now, he talked about, you guessed it, the Constitution. He talked about a lot of different topics, but he specifically singled out for criticism a Democratic senator from Arkansas named William Fulbright, who was a very prominent figure in his day. And Reagan said in that speech 60 years ago, Senator Fulbright has said that the Constitution is outmoded. He said the president is our moral teacher and leader, and that yet the president is, quote, hobbled by restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document, close quote. And whereupon Reagan, was not going to have any of that, but he signaled his dispute or disdain with Senator Fulbright with, an arched eyebrow. You can find the whole speech on YouTube. And of course, as Janine would say, a good actor can communicate something just with a facial expression. You don't need to shout. You don't need to say anything bad. You just simply get the point across with subtlety. Goldwater got clobbered in the 1964 presidential election, but 2 years later, in 1966, Reagan was elected as governor of California, and he was, on his way to greatness. Second, as a presidential candidate in 1980, Reagan supported at least in theory, 2 constitutional amendments, and they're both interesting in their different ways. One was to ban abortion, and the other was to balance the budget. Now, the abortion issue is a difficult, challenging issue, still vexing American politics to this day. But in some ways, for our purposes, in terms of the Constitution, the balanced budget amendment is sort of more interesting, in part because it is so complicated. Those of you, who are students, and well, you're all students, I guess. If you're interested in federal fiscal policy and how the government spends $6 trillion a year, give or take, the federal government, that is, the federal budget is thousands of pages long. It's millions and billions of data points. It's unbelievably complicated. And the idea of using a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, just given the infinite complexity of it all and how easy it is to hide money and not keep track of things and stuff, it would have been just a mistake in the sense of it would have been unenforceable. And that's one lesson about the Constitution. If you pass a constitutional amendment that just simply can't work, the amendment will fail, and you'll diminish the document itself by trying. This is a story of prohibition. The 18th Amendment in 1919 or 18, whatever it was exactly, they attempted to ban alcohol, and it just didn't work, and so they had to repeal it. And so again, the balanced budget amendment was, it's a good idea to balance the budget. It's a good idea to restrain the size of government. That's certainly a constitutional thought. However, the mechanism of a constitutional amendment, the entire Constitution is, including the 27 amendments we have had, is just 4,543 words. It is a brief document, and you just can't overload it with too many extraneous thoughts. So I mean, that was one. Reagan, never denounced the balanced budget amendment. He just simply said, as president, I will do my best to have a good fiscal policy and to cut taxes and increase growth and restrain spending. And, you know, we can argue about how successful he was. I certainly think he was more successful than not, but it is a true fact. You know, the deficit continued, in some ways got bigger, but it's just a lesson. You know, you can be a great president and still have your share of, you know, disappointments or, you know, mixed results and so on. The third brush with the Constitution that I can speak to was in July of 1985, when President Reagan had surgery for cancer. They had to take polyps out of his colon. And for the first time in history, they invoked the 25th Amendment, which speaks to the succession of power if a president is incapacitated. Reagan was, you know, under anesthesia for a few hours, but it was important enough, they thought, to invoke this to make sure that everybody kind of understood that, you know, then Vice President Bush, 41, would be the, you know, in effect, acting president again. This is language the lawyers have all worked out. And as an aside, for anybody studying the Reagan presidency, they'll also run across the moment when President Reagan was also incapacitated, which was back in 1981, March 30th, 1981, when he was shot by would-be assassin, you know, John Hinckley. And, you know, he went under the surgery at George Washington University Hospital, and there wasn't really time to even think about the 25th Amendment. And there was a moment there, anybody who's, you know, old enough to remember this, when then Secretary of State Al Haig sort of marched into the situation, into the White House press briefing room and said, "I'm in charge." I mean, it was a sort of a, you know, frankly, nutty, kind of scary moment. And happily, Al Haig was kind of gone quickly enough from the Reagan administration. But again, the power of the presidency, the importance of the Constitution is so sacred that people, you know, the President Reagan was at great pains to abide by it. And when people didn't seem to abide by it, like former Secretary Al Haig, they were let go. Now, the story of any president is always mixed and complicated. And so another important constitutional issue came up with the Iran Contra story of the second Reagan term, 1985, give or take, to 1989. And Iran Contra, and I realize we're talking events of the 1980s before most of you, sorry, Kathy, were born. But, you know, it was a deal where there were rebels against the communist government in Nicaragua. The communists were called the Sandinistas, and the Sandinistas were communists, and in general, America certainly Reagan supports the anti-communists, but it was extremely controversial. There were plenty of Americans, including in Congress, who either supported the Sandinistas or at least didn't want to oppose them, let them speak for themselves. It was kind of like Fidel Castro, sort of a figure. Oh, you know, I myself here in, you know, Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, I'm not a communist, but I sort of support these kind of indigenous people liberating themselves from Yankee imperialism. It was one of those kind of deals. And so it was extremely controversial. And the Reagan and the Congress passed several amendments, not that Reagan wanted them to, saying you can't have aid to the Contras. You cannot do this. Whereupon, inside the Reagan administration, various figures, like best known of which probably is Oliver North, said, we have a plan to aid the Contras without the help of Congress. We will sell weapons through third-party intermediaries, mostly from Israel, to Iran and get the money, and we will then give the money to the Contras. And it'll be kind of, you know, as Oliver North said, kind of neat. That was a quote from him, neat, N-E-A-T. And again, it was just controversial and difficult and sort of untrod territory. And it eventually it blew up in 1986. In November of 1986, the whole scheme was sort of unveiled. And it was just a massive, you know, blow up. And I won't quite say scandal, because I always thought it was defensible, but, you know, again, I'm a Reagan fan. But again, we're talking about, you know, ways that which, you know, the world has changed. I bet some of you young people might have never really seen a full-blown newspaper, a hard copy, you know, newspaper, you know, and, you back in the 80s, the Washington Post was at the peak of its influence, and it was every day's edition was of paper was 2 or 3 inches thick, and it was just a big fat newspaper. There was not much competition in terms of there was no Fox News, for example, and the Post just, along with the rest of the media, it wasn't really the mainstream media, it was just the media, just went nuts on the story. The Post had every day would have a whole special section of 10 or 15 articles on Iran Contra and how terrible it was and how Reagan had, the phrase they always use, shredded the Constitution. They always said it that way. And it was just, it was a huge deal. And Reagan's popularity fell 20 points. A bunch of people got fired. A bunch of people got indicted. A bunch of people got convicted. It was a genuine constitutional crisis. I mean, whoever, according to the experts in the media, they said it was if enough media people say it's a constitutional crisis, it's a constitutional crisis, whatever the merits are. Again, in the end, and Reagan, to his credit, just said, listen, I know this is controversial, and he sort of, again, this is, historians are parsing all this. He sort of said, I made a mistake, and he sort of didn't say I made a mistake. But what he did say for sure was, we're not going to try and hide this. We're going to let the investigators investigate. And so the Congress investigated. They created special committees to investigate this. They hired an independent counsel, which is another whole issue. The constitutionality of goes back and forth and so on. But in a moment when the 3 branches, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative, were all kind of at odds with each other over this, and 2 of the 3 branches wanted to investigate the other, Reagan said, okay, this is the Constitution at work. I am going to let this process continue. I'm not going to interfere with it. I'm going to tell my people, look, testify, give them your documents, don't hide, don't lie, don't perjure yourself. And, after 2 years of real stress, and the investigation lasted longer than 2 years, but Reagan's presidency ended, of course, on January 20th, 1989. People said, well, that was a big deal. Okay, fine. But Reagan was a great president. The Berlin Wall is coming down. The Soviets are defeated. The economy is booming. And so the country as a whole made a judgment on, the wisdom of the Reagan presidency, including the fact that, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, was elected in a huge landslide in 1988. So that was just a moment there where, President Reagan, if you want to say he made a mistake or did something wrong on the Iran Contra thing, fine. But you also have to say that in the investigation that followed, he just did it the way he was supposed to, the way any good president would do it. And the 5th thing, which element of the Reagan presidency, which is interesting to me, is his Supreme Court nominees. Every Constituting America chat ends up talking about the Supreme Court one way or another because it's such an important issue. And I can just review a little bit Reagan's Supreme Court nominees, who were, of course, any one of them important. The first one that he had, back in 1981, was Sandra Day O'Connor, who was famous for being the first woman to be on the Supreme Court and so on. And, she was very much admired and so on, but she was not really a conservative. I mean, she was well, I won't say to the left, but she was the moderate. And there's nothing wrong with being a moderate, but Reagan was a conservative. And after the realization came, after the excitement, oh, first woman, this is exciting. The realization that a conservative Republican president was nominating people to the Supreme Court who were, to the left of him, began to sink in. And in particular, the within sort of the Reagan orbit, a bunch of young lawyers created something called the Federalist Society, which was created in 1982 and was an avowedly conservative place, and they would say constitutional, pick your word, view of things that just was realizing that, in their view, that the American Bar Association, which was sort of the establishment engine, was moving to the left and is now, people would say, is kind of woke. But at the time, it was just simply liberal. And they were feeding a Republican president justices and other judicial appointees, who were, it sort of evolved. And so in 1986, and the Federal Society got going in 82. And so you can't really say that just in 4 years they were shaping American judicial policy, but certainly that sort of thinking was going through. And so in 1986, when Warren Burger, an appointee from Richard Nixon, retired, Reagan elevated William Rehnquist, who was a conservative, and made him the Chief Justice in 1986, and then also appointed Antonin Scalia, who, amazingly enough, Antonin Scalia, died in 2016, but he was a major intellectual figure and a pop, just a major force within the judiciary. And it's amazing to think that he was confirmed 98-0 in 1986. It just goes to show you that things have changed. But then in 1987, President Reagan nominated Robert Bork, who was a distinguished judge and author, and again, a major intellectual force on the right, and definitely a hero to the right, but extremely polarizing and had plenty of enemies. And so Reagan appointed him in 1987, toward the end of his presidency. And there was a ferocious fight. Kind of anybody who was around then, with any scholar of how judicial appointments work, would say the Bork appointment was a watershed in the way the Senate handles confirmations. And so anybody ever since then, many of these confirmations have been quite bitter, and are oftentimes 51-49 kind of affairs. But Bork was ultimately defeated in 1987. And again, it's just a major moment. And then Reagan, it's kind of funny, sad. Reagan appointed a fellow named Doug Ginsburg, who was also a federal judge, who Ginsburg said, well, I smoked marijuana once or twice. And that, at the time, that was just, the roof caved in on him. And now, nobody would really care, but at the time it was a big deal. He had to withdraw, whereupon Reagan appointed Anthony Kennedy, who just retired a few years ago, as, and he got through. So Reagan, of all the things that Reagan made a change on, he certainly changed fiscal policy and tax policy. He certainly changed foreign policy. But his impact on the judiciary was not that great, because he just, A, because the conservatives would get beat, and B, because he was oftentimes appointing non-conservatives. And so he just simply, again, it's a reminder, you can be a great president and still, you're somewhat of a vessel on the currents of the time, and the currents just the currents on legal policy today are much more polarized and divided. And so figures like, Sandra Day O'Connor or Anthony Kennedy just simply don't get nominated anymore. The conservatives think they're too liberals, and the liberals think they're too conservative. And so both sides are not going to their base. So as a loyal Reaganite, I'm delighted, to be here, first of all. And second of all, to say that, Reagan, as the 40th president, was a link in the chain of the Constitution. He, I think, very much upheld it. Whatever you want to say about his politics, which I obviously support, I think even his worst enemy would say that he was a good steward for the Constitution during his 8 years. And I think that's about as good a thing you can say about any president of either party across the 235 years of our history. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Jim. That was a fascinating overview. And I think you covered every major constitutional issue in Reagan's 8 years in office. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Janine.
Hello, I am Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. Hello, Jim. Thank
Hi there.
you. Hi. Okay, so can you talk to me about his balanced budget amendment? I would like to hear about that. What was in it, and what happened to it?
Well, the balanced budget amendment, was a sort of attempt to make a simple, popular point and write it into the Constitution. And so again, nobody got that far with an actual amendment, but essentially would say you got to balance the budget. And again, balancing the budget is a perfectly valid, good, popular goal. It's happened, only a few times in the last 100 years. The challenge is trying to write it into a statute, and again, there's been, tons and tons of, many decisions in the last few years. The many of which are coming from the so-called Chevron deference of 1984. But the most spectacular case just this year was the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo case, which said, in effect, that the federal government cannot take it upon itself to write out and articulate what the Supreme Court calls major questions on its own. It has to follow congressional guidance, and this has been a major. It's going to cause just a revisitation of just every federal regulation sooner or later. There's dozens of cases now saying that the federal government has overreached on this, and so the challenge with a balanced budget is to say, if you look at an average constitutional amendment, there are a few hundred words at most, and to say that you're going to try and articulate, well, under what circumstances are the federal budget to be balanced under? Is it 1 fiscal year? Is it 2 fiscal years? Are you talking about off budget, things? Are you talking about resources? Are you talking about the Social Security Trust Fund? Are you talking about, long-term contracts? It's as if, in 1789, it's possible to imagine that the Constitution would have included something that said, well, look, we'll always be a friend of the French because they helped us in the Revolution. We'll always be an enemy of the English because we opposed them in the Revolution. And it would have made a mess because you wouldn't have been able to figure out, well, 100 years later, 200 years later, what does that mean in terms of, would you be able to help Churchill against Hitler and so on and so on? So, sometimes when you find yourself, the genius of the Constitution is it is a lean document. It doesn't speak much to any kind of policy either way. It's all about process and rights and procedures, all of the key things there, without much, if any, really specific policy content. And so I think a balanced budget amendment would not have worked. It would not have been enforceable, and it would have been an
Okay, well,
embarrassment.
I guess I thought I heard you say. Of course, I know that the balance, but about any sort of amendment, according to the Constitution, has to start in Congress. 2/3 of the Congress has to approve it. 3/4 of the states then have to approve it. Another way a balanced budget amendment could be passed is through a convention of states, where 2/3 of the states meet and pass it, and then 3/4 of the states also ratify it. But I thought I heard you say something about a balanced budget amendment, that Reagan was for it. I did I just yes or no really quickly, and then because I want to follow up. Did you say that?
He's in the 1980 Republican platform, the balanced budget amendment. I'm sure Reagan said it more than once about the.
Okay, so in the Republican platform, they talked about they wanted to have a balanced budget amendment. The goal for that is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, because obviously the president can't do that, but we do know presidents can help, cheerlead an idea to Congress. So did he try to get Congress to get excited about a balanced budget amendment, or was that just in the platform?
I mean, not really. And that's the point. It was just one of those moments when I mean, Reagan would have loved to balance the budget. He proposed deep budget cuts, most of which Congress rejected. And, and it was just really difficult. I mean, it was the fiscal battles.
Okay, well, I guess what I'm asking you, I thought I heard you say balanced budget amendment. You did say that, right?
I did. I did.
Okay.
That sometimes as president, you support things with various degrees of intensity. And in Reagan's case, the balanced budget was low intensity.
That was what intensity for Reagan?
Low intensity. It was not.
Oh, okay. Well, I just grabbed onto that because I thought that was interesting and very timely for today, because I think a balanced budget amendment would be really, really, as we like to say, Jim, nuanced, and would take a great amount of intensity of thought, and you would have to have really great minds and thinkers along the lines of our founding fathers to actually construct that amendment. But it would be a wonderful thing to have that amendment I don't think it would be like we can't ever be a friend of France, or we can't ever be an enemy of France. We can't ever be a friend of England. I think that that's obviously something that was never going to stick. But a balanced budget amendment, I do personally think would be a wonderful thing. Can you go? I heard you talk about the Federalist Society too, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Isn't that kind of considered a conservative organization today? But are you saying in the 80s it was liberal, but it was meant to be started as conservative? Could you clarify the Federalist Society for me a little bit?
Yeah,
I know it's pretty much lawyers now.
it was conservative, although they would say, and the founders, I think, are all still alive, and so there's, including, the most famous Leonard Leo. He's not the founders, but anyway, they're all around. David McIntosh, they're all around somewhere. I think they would say we are originalists, which is a term of art for the Constitution, where we say that, again, when Reagan was criticizing Senator Fulbright in that speech of 1964, and Fulbright was a very respected figure, but he spoke to a widely held and really dominant school of thought through the 20th century, that, and starting with Woodrow Wilson, and at the beginning of the 20th century, the Constitution is a limiting document. We have to evolve, grow. The phrases like legal positivism were involved and stuff, where we have to just realize and be realistic that the Constitution doesn't mention television or railroads or the internet or anything. So how could you possibly let yourself be limited by this document? And this
Are you trying to say they thought it was a living document back then?
The Federalists were reacting to the liberal ethos of the time. They said, no, this living Constitution thing is wrong. And Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court justice I mentioned earlier, was very much, they wrote books about this. And again, this has been one of probably the biggest debate in legal affairs, left and right, has been sort of living versus originalism, we could say. Do you think the Constitution should?
So the Federalist Society, for clarity, and I need to move on, everybody else has, but the Federalist Society, they were originalists.
They're originalists, yeah, or constitutionalists, or people would say, look, you guys are conservatives, you guys are right wingers, and they wouldn't really deny it. And look,
okay. So it started as that, and it's pretty much still that today, from what I understand. I was just a little. I was trying to follow your great mind there, Jim.
Well, thank you. Yes, the Federal Society would say
you have all this information in your head, and I was just trying to clarify.
Federal Society would say we want to keep the Constitution as written, and understanding. Again, you have to make changes for nuclear power and electricity and so on, but we want to always be as sedulous about applying what James
original intent.
Spent some time going through Federalist Papers for students and stuff. Again, plenty of Supreme Court justices and U.S. senators are sitting around reading the Federalist Papers to this day, trying to figure out, well, what did Madison or Hamilton or Jay or whoever have in mind when they what they say about the Electoral College. What do they mean? This is not the final word, but it's because it's not the Constitution, but it's important insight into what they were thinking as they were drafting it.
Original intent. Yeah. Okay. In closing here, very quickly, Rehnquist, Senator O'Connor, and Kennedy, they all ended up being pretty, well, what would you say they were? Middle of the road? Not right or left?
Well, Rehnquist was a conservative. O'Connor was a moderate. They had several cases on abortion and affirmative action, just got on the list, and she was not a liberal, but she was not a conservative. And the Federal Society said, we need a better system for identifying and recruiting conservatives. Again, this is not to say the Federal Society is right, it's just their point of view. And when
I'd actually moved on from the Federal Society and was just talking about the three nominees, the three Supreme Court justices that he put on the bench, were centrist, I guess. Kennedy, Rehnquist, and O'Connor were pretty much centrist, which, as you say, would be almost impossible to even get someone like that on the Supreme Court today. But was Scalia one of his too? Was he at 4? Did he put 4? Was Scalia his?
Reagan had O'Connor Rehnquist was an elevation. He was not a new member. He was just elevated from associate justice to
Oh,
chief.
okay.
And then
Uh,
it was Scalia and Kennedy with the three. And again, some presidents, that's one quirk of being a president. Some presidents get a lot of nominees, and some presidents get
yeah.
none. Carter, for
Okay.
example,
Well,
had zero.
I need to pass now. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I don't mean to cut you off. I just need to pass. But so just really quickly, in like 1 second, Scalia was not under Reagan.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
His appoint. So Scalia was appointed under Reagan.
O'Connor, Scalia, and Kennedy were the three.
Ah, okay, okay, okay. And then Rehnquist was just promoted. Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, thank you. I'm going to pass now to Julie.
Hello, this is Jewel Gilbert. Thank you, Mr. Pinkerton, for this incredible overview of the history regarding Reagan and his relationship with the United States Constitution. We had a great discussion covering FDR last time. Now, I wonder, as far as Reagan's political understanding of the Constitution, would we understand him as being closer to an originalist?
Yes. He look, Reagan was not a lawyer, and he was not given to long discussions of the Constitution. It just didn't. It was the big issues in his life in his presidency were foreign policy and the economy. And so, but Reagan would certainly say, I believe that he was against. I could remember him saying this. I'm against, the phrase he would use is legislators in black robes. And that is judges who think they really are here to make policy on whatever the issue was, and but they're sort of hiding under judicial garb to set legislation, as it were. And Reagan was definitely against that. And again, that's an originalist argument. Look, we don't need judges to be members of Congress. We need judges to be judges. As Chief Justice Roberts says all the time, we're here to call balls and strikes. We're here to be umpires, not crusaders. And so Reagan was definitely on that side. Yes.
And then Reagan, it's so interesting that Reagan comes from, of course, an acting background, and he's the president of the Screen Actors Guild prior to becoming governor of California. So you said that Reagan wasn't going to give you a long, philosophical discussion about originalism. That's not where his political foundation was. What was Reagan's political foundation, and was the term conservatism already understood then to what it means today?
The term, I would say he in his life he changed. I mean, he was born in 1911, and until about 1952, he would have said, I'm a liberal Democrat. And he supported FDR, he supported Harry Truman. I think the first Republican he voted for was Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, who was not a big right-winger either. He was very much, a moderate. And so Reagan, I guess you could say, moved right during the course of his life. And he was, if you asked him at any point in his life, do you believe in God and country? He would have said, of course. And that was just sort of the basis of his thinking on the world. In terms of the issue probably that most motivated him, again, this is the stuff that look, they're still writing books about Reagan. They probably always will. But I would say it was anti-communism. I'd say that the communist, again, he was born in 1911. The Russian Revolution was 1917. The Mao Zedong Revolution in China was 1949. These are the things that kind of shaped him. And in his experience at the Screen Actors Guild, and this is the most dramatic moments came because he was president of SAG, Screen Actors Guild, from the 40s into early 50s, and then again briefly in the late 50s, was the issue of communist infiltration. There was a lot of communists had snuck into the unions, including the theatrical unions, during the Depression and World War II. And the Congress and the FBI were kind of trying to weed them out in the late 40s and, get them out of threats to the country. And Reagan was on the side of the FBI and Richard Nixon and the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC they called it. And it was a point there where it's in his biography, I felt like I better carry a gun, as I'm driving around Los Angeles in 1947 or so. And, there's that intense feeling about, communist versus anti-communist. And so I would say, again, Reagan's presidency was at 1981 to 1989, and the Berlin Wall came down after Reagan left, but not long after. And I think he would have said that's the greatest, tribute to the success of a bipartisan anti-communist policy that really began with Harry Truman 4 decades prior.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, many of us got to know Reagan again when the Reagan movie came out recently. And going back to watch Reagan clips, it's hard not to be enthralled by his charm and by how much he seems to care about individual people when he speaks about the American dream or what America means to him. It's almost as if he's talking to the whole nation, but it's like he's talking to one person. So I keep pushing on his political ideals, because when you ask someone of the generation, and when we look at the feeling from that generation, Reagan served 2 terms and had his vice president elected after him, and that is quite a mandate of a country's feeling like, wow, he was a success for us despite disagreements or him being more conservative than the country may have been, or the Iran Contra affair. It's a really cool period to study because of that. And watching it, I encourage people to watch clips that they've on this show that I've recently refound, because it's just he's such a powerful character in our nation's history. And that's why I want to ask some of these questions to you, who served in that administration, about his political beliefs, because coming from what you just said, so going from Democrat who loved America, but then to a Republican conservative who loved America, there's a lot there for us to, I guess, understand.
There is absolutely, and look, Reagan, made it in life as an actor, and then on radio and television. I mean, he spent his entire life, active career, in front of a camera or microphone, and that definitely teaches you things about people and so on. And to his, he's successful at it. So in addition, and again, by the time he became president, he was elected when he was 69 years old and had lost a good chunk of his hearing, which believe me, that comes with age. And by the time he was in the White House, he just was not, he could communicate, but he had trouble hearing sometimes. And so sometimes he'd sit in a cabinet meeting and just smile because he just couldn't hear people cross-talking and so on. And this led plenty of people, back when the Washington Post was influential and stuff, oh, he's stupid. He's just sitting there smiling, he's stupid. And what they didn't know until after he left the presidency was he kept a diary. And the diary it's fully online. It's available. They published it in books, but it's also online. You can search it, and you see him thinking about every issue, from education to communism to any issue you can think of. And he's genuinely thoughtful and well-read. And they've gone back and looked at the speeches he gave, and they see that in many, many cases, going back to the 50s, the speech he was delivering was one he wrote himself. He had notes. He read books. He had 3x5 cards. But he had because he was, again, the Hollywood training made him remarkably effective. He would, again, this is pre-digital technology. He had organized thoughts on paper, 3x5 cards, and here's one I want to say about, Whittaker Chambers or Hayek or somebody. And here's one of, tax cuts, whatever. And he'd sort of organize them and shuffle the cards and so on, and organize his speech that way. And this was him doing it. This was his own thoughts doing it. And again, anybody who just wants to get to know the guy better can go through his diary and just read his own, and you can see his own handwriting. I mean, and it's things that are quite moving. I mean, for example, he was shot in the abdomen in 1981, and he's in the hospital, a day or two later after recovering, and saying, I have to pray for the guy who shot me. I'm sure it was the hardest prayer ever, but nonetheless, he had those kind of thoughts.
That's a remarkable resource. That is absolutely remarkable resource to have. I didn't know that existed. I'm certainly going to search it, and I guarantee many of our audience will. Thank you for answering our questions. I want to pass to Kenyon. Wow, we definitely could go long on Reagan. Thank you, Mr. Frank.
Hi, this is Kenyon on, and thank you, Mr. Pinkerton, for being on today. My first question is on his economic policy is that did he actually fully meet the economic goals that he set out at the beginning of his presidency? Because I know I've done I did a little research on it before I came on here, and I know that there's mixed views on how well things worked out with his economic policies.
Well, I mean, it's again, there's plenty of controversy and plenty of people, dislike Reagan and oppose his policies and so on. And again, it is worth keeping in mind he ran on a platform of tax cuts, tax rate reductions, more precisely in 1980, and won 41 states and won by 10 points. And he ran for re-election on a platform of tax cuts and tax reductions, and he won 49 states. I mean, if you do the math on Reagan's electoral history and electoral success with the country, he's right up there with FDR and George Washington in terms of, wow, people love this guy. And, again, not to say everybody did, and it's fair to say most of the intelligentsia and the journalists and so on were opposed to Reagan, and, we're calling him, every possible name. But the results of, the real GDP of the country rose, gross domestic product rose by 1/3, adjusted for inflation during Reagan's presidency. Inflation was 12 or 13% when Reagan took office, and it was 2% when he left. Unemployment went down. I mean, it was, again, it wouldn't be a free country and it wouldn't be a complicated economy if it weren't possible for people to say, oh, Reagan was terrible, he did this wrong and that wrong and so on. But, I think the results speak for themselves, and the mere fact that, when Reagan took office, the top tax rate was 70%. And even now, after going back up and down a few times, it's like 42 or so. So there was the people that even the Democrats pretty much accept the basic outlines of we're going to have a what they call a mixed economy. We'll have a big government, that's for sure, but we'll have a bigger private economy. It's a mix, and people are pretty happy with that, and you don't see anybody, this is again a change from when Reagan began his political career in the at least as a public figure in the 40s and 50s. You could find plenty of people, including in America, who said, we need socialism or communism or something. And now nobody says, I mean, there's somewhere out there saying it, but nobody in a responsible position is saying it at all. It's just a consensus. You just can't make an economy work with socialism or communism, and it's horrible on top of that for human rights and everything. So I mean, Reagan, Reagan was acutely aware of the power of ideas, of just look, we have to, you have to persuade before you can act. You can't, if you try and just jam something through without people thinking it's a good idea, they're going to reject it. It's going to blow up on you. And again, so you have to make the case that, tax rate reductions and free enterprise and, markets are just a better way to do things. And again, not only will you make the case as president, you'll also see your appointees doing sort of remarkable things that maybe you as president never even knew about. For example, Reagan's appointee to be chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Again, the FCC was created in 1934. It is a venerable sort of bureaucratic agency. And, and again, people, you can Google it and see what people say about the fairness doctrine, any number of issues that the FCC has wrestled with over the decades. But in a very obscure but unbelievably important ruling in the early 80s, Fowler said there's this new thing called the internet. And nobody really knows what it is, but we're not going to let the phone companies charge telephone rates for data usage. It was just a choice they made to open up this thing. And Mark Fowler, was, Reagan's appointment. I won't guarantee, I strongly suspect Reagan had no idea what his appointee was doing. Not that he opposed it, but again, if you set a good tone, you hire the right people. They say personnel is policy. Reagan was appointing people who wanted innovation and progress and technological change, and they would do it just because that's what they believed in, without having to try and take orders from Washington, from the White House or the West Wing or the Oval Office. And again, the internet has been the most spectacular economic engine in the last 3 or 4 decades, and really a lot of it is due to this fellow Mark Fowler and something he did 40 years ago, and here we are.
Yeah, thank you. I like economic stuff because it's because of the current state of the United States. I'm interested in that sort of thing. So really quick question, because I know we're close to the top of the hour here. Really quick question. What can you explain his ideas around foreign policy and what maybe we can learn from it today with the current our current geopolitical situation?
Well, I mean, again, Reagan was anti-communist first and foremost, and the communism being sort of the antithesis of a constitution and freedom and everything. And yet, within that, Reagan really tried hard. And some of his best speeches, his speech at Notre Dame in 1981, his speech to the British Parliament in 1982, his speech in Berlin in 1987, when he told, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall. You can find all these moments on YouTube and elsewhere, of course. He was just extremely conscious of persuasion. You have to make the case. You have to respect the audience enough to say, listen, I care what you think, and here's what I think, and here's hopefully you agree with me. And all the skills in movies and television and radio that he had, learned over the decades, he was dedicated to trying to make a connection with you, the listener, you, the audience, you, the voter, and you, the American, but also not just the American, you're the world. I mean, he understood you're making an argument to the world, and again, the Declaration of Independence, begins with if we have a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, we have to lay out the reasons why we're, as the Declaration says, breaking the bonds of affection with Britain, and again, that's just part of the deal. And Reagan fully embraced, the phrase they use was the great communicator. I mean, he had a sense of this. And if you can do that, then you're more than likely to get the Congress to go with you. You're more than likely to, and get the American people. But again, the Constitution the words public opinion do not appear in the Constitution. The words advise and consent of the Senate do appear all over the place. And Reagan just was respectful enough of the process to say, listen, I will, work with the Congress. And then also, again, this is the Reagan touch. I will bring in, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House and the Senate and the Armed Services and so on. I'll bring them with me on this, and we will make a policy on, issues like the Pershing missile. These are, again, things you have to look up, from the 80s that were just incredibly important at the time. How do you get these missiles in Europe to deal, not to fight the Soviets, but to deter the Soviets? And Reagan was willing to, make those and then at the same time, having built up defense and sort of forced the Russians to the table with the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Missile Defense Initiative, then he was willing to negotiate with them and take those concepts of the INF. He put the Pershing missiles in Europe in 1983 and then made a deal with Gorbachev in 1987, the Soviet leader, to take them out or to limit them at least. And that's the kind of flexibility, again, that you kind of learn that, including in, the union politics in the 40s, leading the Screen Actors Guild. I mean, actors are, as bumptious a bunch as anybody, and getting them all to agree on here's what the contract we're going to do with MGM and so on. That was good practice for dealing with Congress 4 decades later.
Thank you for that. That was really insightful on how we can apply that today. And I will pass to Kathy for some audience questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Kenyon and Janine and Jewel. Great questions. And Jim, we could just listen to you all day. So Dwayne Horner says, Jim, my license plate is actually R. Reagan. And he also says another thing Reagan wanted was a line item veto that governors have. Do you think that there can ever be a constitutional amendment passed for fiscal control? And it might be interesting to talk just a minute about the line item veto, because I do remember President Reagan asking for that quite frequently.
He did. And the line item veto would allow a sort of a limited veto. Look, this is in the great endless, fascinating struggle between the executive branch and the legislative branch over who takes the lead on spending and every other issue and so on. Congress has, as a tactic, has sort of gotten in the habit of sort of piling everything into one item and says, listen, if you veto this, you'll be vetoing Social Security and paying off the debt. And, you know, and they try and, but they sort of, you know, they try and just make it into a package, you know, sort of, you can't, don't dare refuse it because the consequences fiscally would just be too calamitous. And so what governors, as the questioner says, many governors, I'm not sure how many, have a line item authority where they cannot veto the entire package. They can just take, as it were, a red pencil and strike out the part they don't like and say, this is where I'm not vetoing the whole thing. I'm just vetoing this appropriation for, you know, X or Y or Z. And I personally think that's a pretty good idea. But, you know, I'm not in Congress and I'm not a Democrat. And so, you know, this is one of those things you just have to haggle out, you know, and some states have it and some states don't. And Congress, and I have to say, just because it's such an important institutional issue, and not every Republican in Congress is for it. Not every Republican says, gee, I don't mind the fact that some president could reach into my budget and kill off the post office or whatever I'm trying to get funded, you know, in here in, you know, state X. And so I would say it's very unclear whether a U.S. national president will ever get the authority of the line item veto. I'm for it. Reagan was certainly for it. Congress was not, and that's why we have a constitution. And, you know, if the president did want it, he or she would have to really campaign on it, except to say, listen, folks, this is going to be central to my presidency about fiscal control and all this kind of stuff, and reform. And so, you know, don't vote for me if you don't want this to happen. But if you do want this to happen, give me a big landslide and support only people in Congress, candidates who support this with me. That's the sort of, you know, seeking a mandate that Reagan tried, and it wasn't his greatest strength. You know, FDR did a much better job. Give me people who will work with me on this. Abraham Lincoln did a better job. You know, Woodrow Wilson did a good job. And you know, presidents you may like or not like, all of them understood that to be fully successful, you need to persuade and you need to bring a Congress with you, because being respectful of the difference of the branches, you have to get them to be with you, to agree with you on things. And that's something where, for all of Reagan's successes, he did not succeed on the line on a veto.
Well, thank you. And we do want to take a moment to recognize our students and teachers that are watching today. D'Angela Hines with Emerald Coast Christian Academy, Hope Mucklow with homeschool students. And we also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone in Las Vegas listening. And Jim, Tracy asked, do you have a favorite story from the time that you were in the Reagan White House, either from maybe a meeting that you were in, or I know you were only 22, so you may not have been in that many meetings with President Reagan directly, but maybe you were, or your boss at the time. Do you have just a sort of an inside story?
Well, I was 22 and I left the White House when I was 25 to go work in the Reagan re-election campaign. So like I met him like 3 times in my life, once at the campaign and twice in the White House, just shaking his hand. So I can't say we had any interchange beyond hi. And yet, but my bosses back then, you know, including Marty Anderson, who, you know, now passed away, and Lee Atwater, who's passed away, and Ed Rollins, who's still around. Actually, I'm going to a party for Ed Rollins. So the 40th anniversary of the '84 Reagan campaign is coming up just in a couple of days. You know, they, you know, this is, again, being president is hard. Okay, that's the one thing you got to get across. You know, some of you may have aspirations for it. Just understand. It may look fun, like riding around Air Force One, pardon me, but it's just difficult. And so one of the issues that Reagan faced, and every president, every politician, every governor faces it, is leaks. So you're doing something and you're talking internally and discussing things and throwing around ideas. And the next thing you know, you're reading it back then, it'd be reading the Washington Post the next morning. Today, you're seeing it in Twitter, you know, 5 minutes later, or on social media somewhere. And so Reagan there were talk that leaks were coming out about the formation of the '84 Reagan campaign. And, again, who was going to be the chairman of state Y or state X and all these decisions and stuff. And so there was a bunch of leaks. And so Reagan called in, Senator Laxalt of Nevada, who was the campaign chairman, and Ed Rollins, who was the campaign manager, and Lee Atwater, who was the deputy campaign manager, and said, look, we gotta stop these leaks and stuff. And everybody kind of looked at their shoes and, denied it and everything. And Reagan just said, look, I'm the only one in this room who has a constitutional right to be here. Okay, the Constitution says I'm president, and so I'm in charge, and all the rest of you are expendable. You don't have to, you don't have a right to be here. You don't have a right to your jobs, and if I can't trust you, I'm going to find some people I can. And it was a moment, and where Reagan was making a point. I can't say that Reagan ended all leaks. He didn't. Reagan was, to use a foreign word, a Menschenkenner, a knower of men. Okay, it's a German word. And, he understood human nature. He was just trying to make a point. Look, I'm not saying we're going to end all leaks. We're just going to kind of, put it to a dull roar here. And they did. And the Reagan presidency, again, any young student, Kenyon, all of you who are, have a lifetime ahead of you to read books about Reagan and not just about Reagan, but about the presidency and about decision making and about leaks. It'll be fascinating. And Reagan has his 8 years where he fought the good fight against leaks with some successes and some failures.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's been a fascinating hour, and what a great way to bring it back to the Constitution. So thank you so much, Jim. And we invite everyone to join us next week. We're going to have a special episode on the Connecticut Compromise, which ought to be really interesting. So we invite you all back to join us Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern next week. And thank you again, Jim. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was fun. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.